The Team 17 vs Amiga Power feud is probably the biggest example of a dispute between a magazine and a games company in the history of the venerable computer, and yet it's something of an odd one, as it does involve two places that were unquestionably a force for good, one of the computer's best magazines and one of the computer's best games companies. You would think what with both of them being quite fiercely independent and headstrong, they would have a lot in common. But in the end it's those exact things that cause them to butt heads. I covered this feud a little while back when I did a history of Team 17, well a few years back, but it's worthy of a video of its own. While I only did a relatively quick look at the feud back then, there's a whole lot more detail that needs to be highlighted, especially when it comes to the harsh words that were said back then and the other magazines that were involved in the scuffle, particularly Amiga Power's next door neighbours, Amiga Format. There's more to this than just Team 17 and Amiga Power fighting over review scores. It's a huge argument over just how to fly the flag for the computer, happening at a time when, well, the Amiga wasn't yet dead, but it was certainly starting to smell funny. So how did these two legends end up falling out so hard? Let's get into it. While the main part of this feud didn't really kick off until 1995, it could be said that relations between Amiga Power and Team 17 were always a little bit fractious under the surface, although they weren't really any more fractious than the relations that AP had with most other companies. Generally speaking, Team 17 got good ratings from the mag. A lot of their most famous games, the likes of Body Blows, Apidia, Assassin, Super Stardust, all of these did pretty well indeed at AP Towers, with a couple of them getting 90% plus scores. Still, this was counterbalanced by a few of their biggies getting a bit more criticism. Alien Breed 1 and 2 both scored in the low 80s at Amiga Power, while Project X and Super Frog were both scored 78. In the case of these games, AP scores were certainly lower than what other mags gave, although they're still good when you consider that AP used the whole of the percentage scale, meaning that a ban average game would actually get around 50% as opposed to, say, the 75 it might get in other publications. Still, Team 17 didn't much care for the use of the percentage score. To be fair, a lot of games companies didn't, and they seemed to believe that Amiga Power weren't exactly big fans of their work, and actually treated them harsher than they did other developers. Before things blew up, Team 17's reactions tended to be hidden away in games, and while there was a bit of jokiness about them, they're clearly based in ill feeling. There's the finished games only, jibe that's included in the 92 special edition of Alien Breed, or AP writers being included in Arcade Pool and given terrible stats. Arcade Pool being a game that originally got a 60% score in the mag, until AP found out they'd accidentally reviewed an unfinished version, at which point the score was righted and it got 91%. At around the end of 1994, you do start to get a handful of Team 17 games that get some pretty low ratings from Amiga Power, and this is where the feud does start to take form. Alien Breed Tower Assault, while not one of the games mentioned in the feud, is kind of a starting point for this. While most other mags were pretty high on the game, Jonathan Nash didn't hugely care for it at all, and he only gave it 46. I mainly mention this because you would expect that a game in a big series like Alien Breed getting such a critique would be the spark to set things off. However, it wasn't. The two games that did were, relatively speaking, much more minor. In the July 1995 issue, Amiga Power reviewed ATR, a racing game, and Kingpin, a 10-pin bowling game, and they didn't like either of them. Paul Mellerick gave Kingpin 47%, and Jonathan Nash gave ATR 38%, which was the lowest score given to a Team 17 game in the mag's history. And thanks to this 1-2 punch, all hell would break loose. ATR and Kingpin, despite being relatively minor titles in the whole Team 17 canon, especially Kingpin, seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back as far as any relationship with Amiga Power went, along with a feature that they used to run in their news section called The Disseminator, which openly compared the scores that AP gave games to the ones that mags from rival publishers such as The One and Amiga Action gave them. The low scores given to ATR and Kingpin would see Team 17 break all contact with the magazine, as well as having other magazines sign a declaration that they wouldn't let AP staff see any of their new games, this being primarily aimed at Amiga Format, the guys who were also published by Future, and indeed were operating next door. One particular example of this being enforced was when Jonathan Nash once strolled into Format's offices, as he often did, where he spotted Alien Breed 3D running. Before he could really sit down to have a look at it, he was quickly shooed away by Steve McGill, previously of Amiga Power, who didn't seem to want to do it apparently, but didn't have much of a choice. AP's reports on this were kept pretty straightforward. In July of '95 they said that Team 17 had fallen out with them for their own personal reasons and not to expect any previews or news about the studio's upcoming games, as they wouldn't be able to review them until they were out in the shops. And indeed that's pretty much how Finns would say. The likes of Worms never got a full preview in AP, and it would indeed end up receiving one of Power's most controversial scores. Jonathan Davis just didn't much care for the game, considering it inferior to its main inspiration, Scorched Tanks, in terms of gameplay, and gave it 60%, a total outlier compared to the love Worms got most everywhere else, and undoubtedly something that did help fan the flames of the feud. Power did manage to squeeze a preview out for the Spirus Legacy, a game that ended up scoring 50% in February '96, but only because they were able to talk to the developers who weren't in-house. They'd ran Team 17 up for a little detail by impersonating a boy called Ernest, and they'd swiped a copy from the folks next door. Still, it should be mentioned that Alien Breed 3D, released months after the feud started, scored 89% in the mag. We'll get back to it later, but there isn't a whole lot to suggest that, despite the state of relations between magazine and company, AP weren't appraising these games on their own terms. It should be noted that a man named Marcus Dyson, who'd once previously edited Amiga Format, was at this time a producer at Team 17, and he would in fact become Team 17's most vocal voice against Amiga Power. And in fact, it's not like all of this comes simply from interviews and sit-downs that reveal all the behind-the-scenes details long after the fact. This was a public feud that would even play out in the pages of magazines. Of all places, a rather little-known French magazine called Amiga Concept would be the main theatre of combat, the place where some of the most scathing words about Amiga Power were written. Amiga Concept certainly aren't subtle about their criticism. Right on the front page of the May '95 issue, alongside the cover discs, the ECTS show report, and an interview with David Pleasance, we've got the whopping big cover line, Rant. A Power is having fun killing the Amiga. Much like the stereotypical menu at a fancy restaurant, the article's all in French, but it's easy enough to get a translation. The article, written by Stéphane Gabillot, is a special edition of a monthly press review that Amiga Concept ran, and it consists of a full-blooded assault over 2 pages, one that initially starts out by attacking ATR's score of 38%. By comparison, Amiga Concept scored ATR 92 in April. It goes on to say that Amiga Power's scores are more likely to sink the Amiga than the PC is, taking particular issue with the monthly disseminator feature, and questioning where AP gets the balls to proclaim themselves the supreme truth regarding game reviews. The screed against the Rosbeefs continues by saying that they understand exactly why Team 17 would no longer wish to communicate with Amiga Power, that they believe AP would quite possibly welcome the disappearance of the Amiga, and it ends by bemoaning anything apparently going in order to prevent the Miggy from reclaiming its throne. Ouch. It should be said that while Amiga Power's low score of 38% for ATR was indeed, again, something of an outlier, and that most mags did indeed give the game pretty high marks, it is notable that formats were also a little bit iffy on the title, only rewarding the game 70. In both reviews, the game generally gets compared to Codemaster's Micro Machines, and it's found to be wanting. As it is, it's certainly not a bad top-down racing game at all, with Amiga Format score perhaps being the closest to the mark, neither worthy of a 38% drubbing or 92% idolatry. Thusly, it's kind of amusing that ATR, of all titles, is a spark that sets off this particular fire. Similarly, while Kingpin is perhaps not the swass of 10-pin bowling games, as Marcus Dyson suggests, it's also not a bad game or anything. It's just, well, in the end it's a 10-pin bowling game, and that's not a genre that exactly sets the pants on fire. Anyway, the action continues on the next page. Amiga Concept's editor, Imre Antal, has a go himself in an open letter, also questioning the 89% score that Amiga Power gave an audiogenic game called Super League Manager, which at that point they'd only seen a demo of, but they didn't think lived up to AP's assessment. In the interests of dissemination, Amiga Concept never reviewed Super League Manager, although AP's score for the game did actually end up being a bit higher than other mags, who seemed to mainly score it in the 70s. But hey, the bloke who reviewed it, Steve Farragher, pretty much reviewed all of Footy Manny games going at AP Towers, and he enjoyed Super League's cocktail of having a fictional setting for a change to go along with the details you expect from this sort of title. The editorial is at pains somewhat to say that Amiga Concept aren't sucking up to Team 17, it accuses Amiga Power of deliberately killing the Amiga, once again, believes that the reviewer for ATR, that being Jonathan Nash, couldn't have spent more than 10 minutes with the game, and even insinuates somewhat that merits shouldn't fall on certain undeserving publishers who would benefit from preferential treatment. Paired up with the questioning of AP's review of Super League Manager, well, the implication is pretty clear. Thirdly, we have the attack from the source, a letter from Marcus Dyson. Marcus Dyson accuses Amiga Power of attacking not just ATR and Kingpin, but all of Team 17's products, says that the review for Kingpin is full of errors, and that ATR's reviewer clearly took more pleasure in giving a childish review rather than an objective one, says that their reviews are an insult both to Amiga buyers and the editors of other magazines that Amiga Power routinely scores games 20 to 30 points lower than, and that they either don't know how to recognise a decent game, or that they have problems with Team 17. To which Dyson posits that most publishers have problems with Amiga Power. Even a positive review for a Team 17 game is explained away in rather curious fashion. Super Stardust gets 89% from Amiga Power, but Dyson says that they gave them an exclusive for it, with the full game and cover disc. This kind of works in tandem with the allegations made previously, an attempt to provide evidence that yes, the oh so honourable and rigorous AP can be bought. In fact, this ends up quite outrageously simplified in retrospect, because, as revealed in AP2, Super Stardust was one of the few games that they had to review an unfinished copy of due to the game being delayed, so the copy they had wasn't a full one at all. Reviewing unfinished games was an absolute no-no for the magazine, as laid down by their policy of truth, but something that they had to do here simply because there was no alternative whatsoever to doing so. It was the only game available worthy for the cover, as the month's other big releases, specifically Rough and Tumble and Theme Park, were already taken by other mags. Also, the special third cover disc that was supposed to be a demo for Super Stardust wasn't for that game. It was supposed to be, but wasn't because of aforementioned delays, and Team 17 provided a demo for Alien Breed Tower Assault instead. In short, it feels like a massive reach to suggest that the only reason Super Stardust got a score of 89% was because of this exclusivity, especially considering Amiga Power adored the original Stardust, which got the exact same score a few months earlier. Dyson closes by saying that the Amiga public deserves better. Kind of similar to what Amiga Power would often say, but very much turned in the other direction. Finally, we do have a right of reply. Jonathan Davis, then editor of Amiga Power, writes his own letter justifying their thoughts on both ATR and Super League Manager, saying that each game must be judged on its own merits, and not just by generalising that Team 17 are one of the Amiga's best companies, saying that Amiga Power don't consider themselves to be in competition with other Amiga mags, and that they don't think they're leading readers down the wrong path. All they're doing is being honest. AP believes that the way to help the Amiga is through wanting people to buy games they'll enjoy, because otherwise they will walk away disappointed and less willing to support the computer, and that when a game publisher responds to an Amiga Power review with letters of solicitation, as opposed to taking lessons from it for their next game, it looks shameful. So, yeah, What to say about this piece? Where did it even come from? From what I can gather, Amiga Concept's usual press review would indeed feature highlights and commentary on the reportage of various other MIGI mags, not just fellow Frenchie's Amiga Dream, but others from around Europe such as Germany's Amiga Joker, and obviously all the British ones. With this in mind, it's not like this big old hit piece comes entirely from out of nowhere, as these guys did talk about what was going on at other mags. Even still, it's quite a savage escalation, and it certainly gets very spicy. There's a lot in this piece, especially the implications that AP aren't above taking cash for reviews, despite all they say. That could be considered very libelous indeed. Where on earth, for example, is the evidence to suggest that Super League Manager was a paid-for review, like the piece implies? There isn't any. Poor old Audiogenic have ended up catching a whole lot of unjustified strays here. But let's face it, this is why the piece ends up appearing in a French magazine. Here, it doesn't fall foul of the UK's incredibly strong libel laws. Clearly that's the strategy, especially with Marcus Dyson himself appearing in the piece, as there's no way you would be able to get this printed in, say, CU Amiga or Amiga Action, even if they would almost certainly have jumped at it if it weren't for the pesky legal issues. Clearly it's a piece written by true believers, hence why it leads with the idea that AP is killing the Amiga. Nowadays, such a claim looks ridiculous, especially considering this was written in the middle of 1995. The Amiga, as a games computer, is pretty close to the finish. Its fate had largely been decided almost 2 years previously, as companies gradually started to leave it behind, seeing that the long-term prognosis just wasn't good. And by this stage, well, the exodus is pretty frickin' massive. The death of the Amiga was much bigger than any magazine, but a lot of people were convinced that it could still make it, that something like, say, the ESCOM takeover could turn it all around, even if rationally, well, it was a moonshot at best. At this stage we're all picking at the piles of carrion on the floor, but some, and I was one to be fair, I was a kid, convinced themselves that they were still feasting on steak at a fancy restaurant. Indeed, Amiga Concept, despite this very same issue's rallying editorial cry proclaiming that the Amiga was not dead, would last a mere couple of months after this piece, another discontinued mag entering the void as the clock inches closer to midnight. So, the upshot of all of this is that Team 17 would attempt to launch a lawsuit at Amiga Power, claiming that their reviews of both ATR and Kingpin were libelous and filled with false information, and not representative of the two games. This attempt at getting the offending reviews purged didn't get anywhere at all, but in filing the action, Team 17 walked down a road that was already rather well ridden. Publishers having jibes at Amiga Power certainly wasn't anything new, although in the past it could at times be a bit more jokey. When the Chaos Engine got a rave review from AP, publishers Renegade ran an advert proudly proclaiming that even that bastard Stuart Campbell liked it. Still, it certainly wasn't always jokey, as the pages of the age-old AP2 get into. Millennium's Keith Smith, for example, once went on a rather long and epic rant when on the phone to AP Towers, blaming them for the Amiga's downfall, wishing death upon the magazine and unemployment on its writers. That doesn't sound very convivial, and it sort of inspired a new feature in the mag called New High Score, where companies were invited to examine AP reviews of their games and say what, if anything, they had learned from them. Also, Team 17 were hardly the first publisher to aim a lawsuit at Amiga Power. Alternative Software tried to sue the mag after Doctor Who Dalek Attack got 28% from them, claiming factual inaccuracies, and Domark tried to do the same after Stuart Campbell's legendarily brutal 2% review of International Rugby Challenge. Again, neither of these went anywhere, and nor did US Gold's threats to get Stuart Campbell fired following his vicious 6% blast of Secret of the Silver Blades, a review that, as the story in AP2 goes, the already stressed and openly dungeon crawler hating staff writer picked up on deadline day after the previously assigned reviewer, the unrelated Colin Campbell, decided to instead spend deadline day drinking on a tourist bus in Bath. Although, just like Team 17, US Gold blacklisted Amiga Power and told Amiga Format to keep their new games out of the hands of the bastards operating next door. Ocean Software, the only publisher who actually did manage to successfully take action against them and get an apology printed over the headline for a letter in Do the Right Fin that said they were a crap company, ran an advert directly aimed at AP in the trade papers, even more specifically at Stuart Campbell, one that could have even potentially resulted in legal action coming the other way. So yeah, it is fair to say that the majority of publishers, well, they didn't like the magazine one bit. Hell, right near the magazine's end, Jonathan Nash ended up fielding a quite brutal call from Jonathan Anderson, the boss of Amiga Technologies, the subsidiary company running the computer for ESCOM, which struck familiar notes and saw the magazine accused of being out to kill the Amiga, with Anderson particularly enraged that Pinball Mania, one of the current pack-in games for the computer, had been scored 11%. He closed the convo by spelling out Jay Nash's surname and saying N stood for nobody, because that's what he was, and I think we can all agree that that is a totally sick burn. Fins got angrier when Jay Nash explained why AP weren't likely to be getting any news from Amiga Technologies about the computer, at which point Anderson called again, threatening to have Nash arrested for recording their previous convo, which he hadn't done, he just simply remembered it. I mean, how can you forget being called a nobody in such a manner? As it was, Jonathan Anderson didn't exactly last long at the head of Amiga Technologies, but it once again shows the friction that the venerable magazine could cause. We all generally know that AP was controversial and had mixed relations at best with other companies, but it's nice to get all of this in a neat little place. I feel I should note that this somewhat strained relationship between AP and various games publishers wasn't just down to honest reviews and using the whole percentage scale or things like that. Truthfully, that frosty relationship existed right from the off, ever since the first couple of issues in which Amiga Power presented previously released and complete games on their cover disc. Issues 1 and 2 featured Bombuzal and Kid Gloves respectively, both games that AP loved, with the idea being that each issue would feature a title from the magazine's all-time top 100. A cool idea indeed, one that perhaps wasn't surprising seeing as Power was, essentially, the Amiga's version of Your Sinclair, and first edited by Matt Bealby, who'd come straight to AP from YS along with several others, and who, naturally at that time, was putting complete games on cover tapes, just as the other specky and 8-bit computer mags were doing. However, ELSPA, the industry body that represented the publishers, had an absolute fit about these free complete games and quickly set about creating new laws stopping this, forbidding Amiga or Atari ST mags from carrying complete commercial games on its cover discs. To be fair, they may have had a point, as the reaction to AP's move from other mags was immediate. In June 1991 issues of the mags, CU Amiga carried the highly rated Gravity from Imageworks after already throwing out Dynamics Army moves for the previous month, Amiga Action carried weird Frenchy sci-fi title and Captain Blood pseudo-sequel Purple Saturn Day, and Amiga Format carried Chris Crawford's all-time classic Balance of Power 1990 edition on their cover disc, all full commercial games, and certainly not any old crap either. If you were buying Amiga mags in June of 1991, you ate like a goddamn kin. But it shows how quickly all the mags were willing to go to DEFCON 3 on this one, and ELSPA were probably right to step in and say that everyone needed to take a chill. This moratorium was observed by all mags, at least until we get to the end of the Amiga's commercial gaming life, although obviously there's ways around this in order to get a cool cover disc that isn't just demos, whether it's complete PD games because they didn't count and were assumed to be of lower quality than commercial releases, or exclusive short demo versions of games, the likes of the Holiday Lemmings titles, or that frickin' excellent mix between Sensible Soccer and Cannon Fodder where you kick a grenade about. Anywho, with Amiga Power kicking off its life by doing something that ELSPA immediately thought was going to kill the 16-bit computer games industry stone dead in a flash, you can perhaps see why the relations between publishers and this particular mag were a little bit frayed. Although of course it wasn't frayed with everyone, and it certainly wasn't frayed at all when it came to developers like Sensible, Bullfrog, Graft Gold and various others. Anywho, back to Team 17. With this whopper of an escalation, Team 17 would end up being the publisher most associated with rallying against Amiga Power by some distance, to the point where nowadays they're the only ones really mentioned as doing so, even if they certainly weren't the only ones who attacked them or attempted to take libel action against them. As far as the pages of Amiga Power went, the spat with Team 17 was at times referenced, largely mentioned in passing, usually something on a review like, well, the RRP's 30 quid, but we found this game for 20, so shop around. Or people just being reminded that they didn't have a whole lot of news to give about the company's new releases. But it didn't fill up the mag in the same way that, say, criticisms of mags like CU Amiga and Amiga Action did. A few months or so after the blowover, AP's newest editor, Tim Norris, would make a call to Marcus Dyson at Team 17 to see if the beef could perhaps be squashed. Dyson relayed the message to the company's boss, Martin Brown, who replied that he'd think about it, and then, well, there wasn't any response after that. The beef still remained, stewing away, and it would remain until Amiga Power came to an end. It is clear, mind you, that things escalated majorly when Marcus Dyson made his move from Amiga Format to Team 17 in 1994. And with that in mind, you wonder if the complete disintegration of relations between Amiga Power and Team 17 was something that stemmed originally from a rivalry that started between the two mags when Dyson was editing Format. And yeah, there's definitely evidence to support that being the case. Indeed, there's evidence directly from the horse's mouth. For most of this history, we go not only to the recaps and accounts that are available on Jonathan Nash and Stuart Campbell's AP2, but also to the old CompSys Amiga Games Usenet group, where plenty of age-old conversations can still be looked at. Marcus Dyson worked on Amiga Format from 1990 onwards, but his editorialship of the mag lasted for a little over a year, starting with the March 93 issue and ending with May of 94, meaning he was at the helm for 16 issues. Of course, if you're just reading the magazines, you probably wouldn't be any wiser when it comes to any possible friction between AF and AP, and hell, you might think that them being next door would mean that relations were pretty friendly, which of course they were not. To be honest, relations between the two mags weren't ever all that good, and it was kind of that way right from the beginning. I should say that one huge help for this video has been Matthew Smith, not the man who made Manic Miner and Jet Set Willy, but the journalist and creator of Amiga Power, the album with Attitude, and he's had a lot of insight on all of this. Things started on the wrong foot, really, with issue 0 of Amiga Power, the one that was included as part of Format's May 91 issue and featured the first AP All-Time Top 100. The trouble was that at the time this list was compiled, the official AP staff only consisted of Stuart Campbell and Mark Ramshaw, so other people also voted on what was to be included in the list, and those would have included Amiga Format staffers. Because of this, a couple of games got on the list that the AP guys, well, they weren't exactly fans of, and yet they would have to write about them. Kickoff 2, which made number 7, is certainly the most well-known example, and would in fact have been number 1 on the list if Stu and Mark hadn't both scored it nil point in order to ensure that Rainbow Islands claimed top spot. But others include Xenon 2, Leisure Suit Larry 3, 2 Rick Dangerous titles and a whole load of flight sims, none of which would ever feature in an AP Top 100 again, and a couple of which would eventually end up getting pilloried by the mag when an opportunity to review a re-release came up. Hilariously, Leisure Suit Larry 3 was number 54 on the first Power Top 100, but Power's actual thoughts on the game are best summed up by Jonathan Nash giving it 9% in August 94, while both Rick Dangerouses were also subjected to a beating later on, getting 17 and 15% respectively from Mark Winstanley in November 94. Hell, if you read between the lines of the entries that these games got in the original Top 100, you might be able to spot the actual opinion of the AP guys. Kickoff 2 is as tricky to control as the first game, and scoring is a real nightmare. Xenon 2 lords the sound and vision while the gameplay gets rather samey. Leisure Suit Larry 3 starts by saying that it's bleeding expensive and takes 5 discs. But the absolute best line is reserved for Rick Dangerous 2, which made number 17 on the list. The opening reads, "Let's get this straight. There are good platform games, there are great platform games, then there's Rick Dangerous 2. Doesn't exactly sound like a winning endorsement when you think about it, does it? I even enjoy the closing line. Don the dangerous garb just once and you'll be hooked. It's almost guaranteed. Almost guaranteed. As in, actually it bloody well isn't guaranteed because we hate this game and we're only writing about it because those bastards next door thought it should be on the list. Anywho, this perhaps contributed to relations between the mags being a little bit frosty from the off, with AP immediately being eager to break out from the shadow of their bigger, more software-inclined brother. Amiga Power particularly didn't like having to print "From the makers of Amiga Format" above the mag's title on their front cover, which they had to do for their first 11 issues until they just refused to do so anymore, at which point it was fully replaced by the more familiar "The Magazine with Attitude." Still, with all of this said, Amiga Power generally refrained from aiming barbs at their nearest competition. After all, they're both part of the future stable, aren't they? Much better to train those cannons on the mags that belong to the rival publishers, the ones that Amiga Power referred to as Current Bun, Michael Jackson, and T for 2 Abiba. However, the shots would eventually get fired, and they wouldn't come from Amiga Power's side. A couple of years down the road, with the aforementioned Marcus Dyson in the editor's chair, open attacks from Amiga Format started coming in the shape of house ads. In other words, in-house adverts for another publication that's a part of the same publishing house as Stable. This means that their attacks on Amiga Power wouldn't run in Amiga Format's pages, they would run in Amiga Power's. There's a whole load of little jibes and swipes included in these. Take, for example, this one from the October 93 issue, a bear with a rope around its neck and the line, "Attitude Schmattitude." Certainly a bit of a parody of Amiga Power's usual house advert style there, something you may think to be largely in jest. However, some of the ads definitely cut deeper. This one from April 94, for example, says, "You've got the power, wouldn't you rather have the big picture?" That's certainly quite the bold-faced barb, and it seems to fly against Future's policy that these house adverts really shouldn't make attempts to denigrate the work of other mags in the stable because, well, surely doing that would be freaking stupid, wouldn't it? Amiga Power certainly thought so, and these AF house adverts enraged them, especially seeing as they weren't ever permitted to respond in kind on Amiga Format's pages. They did, however, make the odd subtle dig on the spine lines of Power, a place where they would put all sorts of odd little references and inside jokes. There's "Ooh, Ah" from April 94, which appears to be related to the Man United cover game and the classic "Ooh, Ah" Cantona chant, but apparently is a dig at Marcus Dyson's 87% review of Microcosm, which kinda says that the game isn't all that playable, but it deserves a high score because, well, it's graphically beautiful, it's a CD32 title, and as such it represents the future of computer games. Then, from July 1995, we have Bung Allegations Fly, which isn't a dig at format per se, but fits in with the whole story. On the surface, this spine line relates to cover disc game Ultimate Soccer Manager, the brilliant title where you can attempt to bribe teams and rig matches and all of that, but this does of course also relate to the Amiga concept article that AP couldn't take libel action against because it was in bloody France. Once Marcus Dyson left the editor's chair to join Team 17, there weren't quite as many of this sort of house advert kicking around on the pages of Amiga Power. Still, the magazines weren't ever too fond of each other, with Format particularly feeling the heat from the competition next door. In a 2021 interview with Paul Monahan for Amiga Addict, Marcus Dyson freely admits that while he did get along with various AP people, including one of his best friends, the former editor Matt Bealby, and even Stuart Campbell until they inevitably fell out, and to be fair, falling out with Stu is almost as inevitable as the tides, Format's feathers were most certainly ruffled by the arrival of Amiga Power. AF was the Amiga's top-selling mag, after all, and it shook them to have the competition for exclusives, features, cover discs and circulation now coming from next door, as well as from older rivals like EMAP's CU Amiga, traditionally the publication that took second place behind Format in the sales rankings. One point that's made in AP2 is that very few people actually cross the floor between the mags. Seeing as how Power and Format are both published by Future, both of them cover the Amiga, and they're literally next door, you would probably imagine that quite a few people ended up working on both mags, shuffling from one to the other. And yet this was definitely not the case. AP2 only mentions Steve McGill as basically the one guy who made the rather short jump from AP to AF, thus making him the old Amiga mag's answer to Sol Campbell. And of course it's after Marcus Dyson makes that jump to Team 17 where things really start to heat up between them and Amiga Power. Now of course before this it doesn't necessarily seem that Martin Brown's company had the best relationship with the mag. I've already mentioned the odd barb that appeared in games like Alien Breed 92 or Arcade Pool, and both of these predate Marcus Dyson joining the company, largely. But in many ways I feel like the big escalation is, in many ways, a continuation of the rivalry that existed between Amiga Power and Amiga Format, because even if Martin Brown clearly wasn't a fan of AP, Marcus Dyson undoubtedly disliked them a whole lot more. Once again, a lot of this looks very silly these days. In the main it's a clash of philosophies rather than a clash of people. I don't mean to paint Marcus Dyson as the devil incarnate because he isn't. He's someone with a job, and that job was representing Team 17. Amiga Format and Amiga Power had very different philosophies when it came to their beloved machine. AF generally didn't care much for AP's approach, and the feeling was mutual, but what's clear is that everyone involved certainly loved the machine, they just disagreed massively on their approach to it, and that disagreement had fermented for years. Still, for the most part, AP didn't make much in the way of massive rebuttals to all of this palaver in their pages, at least until the very last issue. With ESCOM biting the dust, more and more publishers leaving the computer behind, and less games coming out every month, Amiga Power decided to call it quits, with September 96 being the 65th and final issue. A handful of new games are reviewed in this swan song, with two particular reviews really being about a hell of a lot more than simply the titles in question. And while Stuart Campbell's 1% rating for Kickoff 96 is more famous, the focus here is on Jonathan Nash and his review of Alien Breed 3D 2 The Killing Grounds, which is partly a look at the game and partly a look at the state of play between Team 17 and the magazine, highlighting comments that had recently been made on the old information superhighway. Needless to say, things still aren't good. There's a thread on CompSys Amiga Games from April 96 bemoaning the current state of Amiga Power, how the magazine's got smaller while the price has gotten higher, £4.50 at the time for 2 cover discs and around about 60 stapled pages. The problem is straightforward, really. The price of the mag has to go up in line with competition and inflation, but there's less and less to cover in the world of Amiga games each month, and that's all AP does. Unlike the other mags, they don't have software and hardware coverage to fall back on. If the world of games on the Amiga is dying, Amiga Power is obviously dying with it, the numbers dwindling further with each issue. Although it is darkly amusing to see horrible numbers such as around 20 to 30,000 copies being cited as the mag's circulation at the time. Numbers that gaming mags would absolutely kill for nowadays. Anyway, a thread like this provides ample opportunity for folks who didn't much care for the mag in the first place to stick the boot in, and it isn't long before Marcus Dyson comes into the thread with a big old pair of Doc Martens. He starts by saying that we at Team 17 always thought it was shite, before encountering a reply from an Andrew Crane, presumably not he of Bad Influence fame, saying that Team 17 are backstabbing the Amiga, that they don't like AP because they're the only ones with their guts to give their games the score they deserve, and that Jonathan Nash called Team 17 a bunch of whining childish hate mongers, which indeed he did at the end of the mag's review for Alien Breed 3D, an otherwise very positive piece that ultimately saw the game score 91%, despite any ill feelings that existed between magazine and studio. Marcus Dyson gives it the full gun in his reply to our motor-mouthed AP defender, and it's worth quoting in full.
Yeah, but have you ever met Jonathan Nash? I have, and I have never had the pleasure to meet such a whining, hateful child in all my life. He typifies the kind of sad, specky, spotty geek that most misinformed people suspect we computer users to be. And it's fine for you to go quoting a member of AP staff. They have a voice, or at least they used to have. They have the ability to speak to the majority of Amiga gamers, either directly or by word of mouth, every month, whereas we developers have to rely on them to get our opinions across, and very often they distort it for their own ends.
Ouch. Now, a few months later, Jonathan Nash rebuts this round of amazingly poisonous personal abuse, quoting him, by saying that, in fact, he and Marcus Dyson had never exchanged any more than a civil hello during the latter's days at Format, and wondering if he really hates him so much for reviewing some games, if he's playing up his anti-AP stance to please his public, or if he's just a bit mad in the head. The rest of the review isn't all that positive about Alien Breed 3D 2, ultimately giving the game a 59%, although it comes with a fake final score of 98%, sarcastically claiming that with games like The Killing Grounds, there's no reason why the Amiga can't conquer the PC. This feels like a final parting shot to their next door neighbours, who were utterly effusive about the title, not just in their reviews, but in months of previews and features. Format ultimately scored the game 96%, tying SWOS as the highest score in the magazine's long history. So it's kind of amusing that AP's fake score beats that by 2 points, and it would have been AP's top game, if the mark wasn't a total joke. And with that, well, is this the end? Oh no, it definitely isn't. We've still got one big direct public spat to look at, once again happening on the pages of CompSys Amiga Games in a thread announcing the end of Amiga Power from July 31st, 96, titled, "Good News, Amiga Power is Dead." In here, a poster named Peteroo says that it's good news in a practical sense, as the mag had been crap for a long time, although bad in a larger sense as it's the last of the dedicated Amiga game mags still going. Now technically it wasn't as far as the UK goes, seeing as Amiga Action kicked around for a couple of months longer, but hey ho. Again, it's not too long before people who you may recognise start wading into the conversation, and this time it's not Marcus Dyson starting it, it's a certain Scottish fellow with a haircut that is as spiky as his personality. We get a typically vicious Stuart Campbell rant. You know it's going to be a ride when it starts by calling AP's detractors useless, cretinous morons, and only gets more vitriolic from there. He's unapologetic when it comes to accusations of AP being self-indulgent, rails at their rivals for not being informative at all about the games they covered beyond the surface level, or simply using the Dominic Diamond-esque mantra of pants as a substitute for actual criticism of a game, defending AP by saying that as self-indulgent as it might have been, it never failed to back up its opinions. On the inevitable subject of Team 17, Stu says that he challenged them to give an example of a review where they hadn't informed readers with their criticism and they weren't able to give an example of an inaccuracy, this being right at the height of the feud. He says that talk of any vendetta is ridiculous considering that the first Alien Breed 3D scored 91% and made number 12 on the final all-time top 100, and that why the company continually sucks itself up its own arse is a mystery to us. And his last paragraph? Well, again, that's worth quoting in its entirety.
So, Amiga Power is dead. We set the last issue on fire tonight and floated it up the River Avon, a Viking funeral befitting the mightiest computer games magazine ever to try to stop you worthless bunch of feeble-witted tossers from wasting your money on shite games. Lord have mercy on our souls. If you'd really rather read Amiga Action giving Rise of the Robots 93%, have you all forgotten that? Then we'd rather not have had you reading our magazine anyway.
The invective sure was good back when it was just contained to the gaming world, wasn't it? Obviously, Stuart Campbell's post ruffles an awful lot of feathers, and the flaming is most certainly on, although it actually now goes on to a new challenger in the mix, that being Matt Bettinson, staff writer and CD-ROM editor for CU Amiga. As you might expect from someone representing one of AP's most hated rivals, Matt here isn't going to be crying a whole lot of tears over the end of the mag. Again, it's best to quote the relevant section of his post in full.
Don't waste your time flamming for my lack of sympathy. Believe me, the staff wanted the magazine to close. Future looks after its writers and they'd be whisked away to a platform they felt some empathy for. Or rather, some degree of status where they could take their attitude and someone might pay attention. I can't believe no one replied to Stuart Campbell's post in here. A bigger arsehole I've the to see in the industry. Perhaps you didn't realise he actually worked for AP and was representing them with that vile, pointless diatribe he rather illiterately scrawled.
There are indeed a few prominent typos in Matt Bettinson's post that I will try not to highlight, even if it ends with him saying that Stuart Campbell's diatribe was rather illiterately scrawled. It does provide a pretty direct example of the bad feelings that Amiga Power generated amongst mags from rival publishers. Not that this should be a surprise, considering that AP did use a lot of space to rail against CU Amiga, Amiga Action, and The One. Instead, I will leave the takedown of Matt Bettinson's post to the next participant in this flame war, Tim Norris, a Power staffer and the second to last editor of the magazine. Once again, we shall listen in.
I'm afraid I can't sit idly by and allow myself to be described in a public forum as a shit reviewer by a senior staff writer who doesn't know the difference between its and who uses poo as an adjective. As for describing Stuart's posting as having been illiterately scrawled, you might want to consider the beam that is in thine own eye, old love. I mean, really, do you submit your work in that appalling state? If you do, your sub is due for a pay rise. A very big one. You can say what you like about AP, because A, it's closed now, so it doesn't matter anymore, and B, no one cares what you think anyway, but you can keep your abuse to yourself.
There are various other posts in this thread that go over more innocuous details here and there, but we do next have to go to the arrival of Marcus Dr. Dyson to the skirmish. By this stage, any good feelings that may perhaps have existed at one stage between Marcus Dyson and Stuart Campbell have long disappeared into the ether, and Marcus takes aim at Stu with both barrels, questioning the amount of criticism that was present in his review of Kickoff 96, seeing as how that was purely limited to the bottom line section at the end, mocking his own attempt at a lawsuit against Ocean Software for the advert that they ran, and questioning how he can still be a professional critic when he's also director of a consultancy business called Thumbs Aloft that tells companies if their games are any good. Stu doesn't return to this thread, although we will get his rebuttal later, but Tim Norris comes back at Marcus saying that even if Team 17 hasn't talked of any vendetta between them and AP recently, there certainly hasn't been any effort to re-establish relations, even though Tim tried to squash the beef. And he also thinks it's rather hypocritical for Marcus to talk about Stuart spewing anything, considering the spiteful and unprovoked remarks that he made about Jonathan Nash a few months back. Marcus's reply to this doesn't really come back at that, but it does go a bit into his own dislike for Amiga Power.
My ongoing dislike for Amiga Power has never been based upon the comparatively recent disagreement between my employer and them. All anyone has to do is look at the house adverts I used to run in AP when I was editor of Amiga Format, openly mocking the AP. Or even ask my wife. She was art editor of Amiga Power, who for some reason recently have been referring to her as her maiden name. Yet while she was work on it, I still wasn't a fan of its attitude over accuracy editorial standpoint.
In the end, it all comes back to a fundamental disagreement in how to best represent the Amiga. In further posts, Marcus goes on to say how he didn't have a problem with most of the magazine's staff at all. Hell, as we can see here, he did marry one of them, that being Amanda Cook, later Dyson. The thread as a whole does rather fizzle out from here, although there's one odd little further tidbit about it in AP2, saying that, well, apparently, the thread itself was actually started by Stuart Campbell under a false identity, just to see what people were going to say. I must say I find this to be pretty wild if that's the case. I checked the group for other postings from the Peteroo person who started the thread, and there's a hell of a lot of activity over several years, so it's not like it's just a quick drive-by. Either some details got a little confused and it was the earlier thread or some other discussion, or it's actually correct, just as written. To be honest, either way is plausible. Speaking of, Stu Campbell's ultimate rebuttal, and perhaps the final contemporary word on this whole debacle, comes in the old pages of AP2 as he takes on Dyson's attack. I mean, you would hardly expect him to leave such a post unanswered, and others like Matt Bettinson also get a bit of treatment, being called a tedious invisible little twerp who should go die up a chimp's arse. It all goes around in circles, if I'm honest. It's Stuart continuing to say that accuracy was the main thing at Amiga Power above everything, and challenging Marcus Dyson or others to give an example where it wasn't, and I am pretty sure that if there was a response, Marcus Dyson would have continued to rail at Amiga Power being about their attitude more than anything else, including accuracy. They're just at complete loggerheads, and nothing's going to change. Here then is pretty much the final word. From Stuart.
Oh, this has gone on a bit, hasn't it? But hey, feel free to keep talking about us. Cheers to all the nice, clever people with a sense of humour who've written in defending AP over the last couple of weeks. The knowledge that there were people out there who understood what we were trying to do was what kept us going for those 65 glorious issues. We love you all, even the stupid scum who deserve to die but aren't quite smart enough to spot an obvious quote when they see one and work out a bit of context from it. Never mind. Guess we'll see you down Electronics Boutique buying a few of the great new Amiga games Team 17 have got lined up for the future.
Now, speaking of AP2, there is a little postscript, a final battle in the Great Amiga Power Wars, one in which Team 17 nor Marcus Dyson were involved, but it's too odd and funny to not post, and I don't really know when I'd get another chance to do so here goes. We go to the start of 1998. Amiga Power's obviously long dead, but AP2, Jonathan Nash and Stuart Campbell's website for the history of the mag, and so much else, is very much alive. It went online in June of 1997 and proved quite popular. Popular enough for a fan to suggest that it should be included on CU Amiga's monthly CD-ROM, which featured a bunch of websites on the disc for the benefit of those who didn't have an internet connection. Now, you probably wouldn't expect CU Amiga to actually do this, would you? I mean, the relations between CU Amiga and Amiga Power made the relations between Amiga Power and folks like Team 17 and Marcus Dyson look positively rosy by comparison. So why the hell would they put a site on the CD that's full of nothing but bad words about CU Amiga, including write-ups on Stuart Campbell penned Usenet threads with catchy titles like CU Amiga sucks dogs' cocks in hell? But they did. The February 1998 CU Amiga Super CD-ROM has frickin' AP2 on it. It's kind of hidden away, but unbelievably, it's there. It goes without saying that no permission to stick this site on a CD and essentially sell it for money, £5.99 to be exact, was obtained from the writers of AP2 by EMAP, nor indeed did any permission appear to have been obtained for the folks behind other sites that were copied onto these discs, and it didn't take long for the folks behind AP2 to find out about it. Stuart Campbell called up EMAP to find out what happened and was essentially told to get stuffed, at which point well, we do actually get some legal action. AP2 did temporarily go offline for a few months in order to stop it from being scraped by CU Amiga or anyone else, and there ended up being a long old bit of action in the courts, both sides spending a bit of cash for their counsel, trying to see just who was in the right here. And in the end, the right fell with Jonathan Nash and Stuart Campbell. In 1999, a few months after CU Amiga's own descent into the void, EMAP settled for $3,000 plus costs, having spent $10,000 on their own legal costs, in a case that could almost certainly have been totally avoided if they just initially held their hands up and apologised for including the website on the CD. Again, the website that has literally nothing good whatsoever to say about the frickin' magazine, and why the hell would you stick it on your CD, you absolute idiots? As opposed to getting all bolshy and telling the AP2 folks to shove it up their arse, essentially daring them to sue. In the end, there was a whole page on AP2 going over these ridiculous events and, well, it certainly feels like a good way to wrap all of this up, to see just how all of these things not only connect, but how it even continued long after damn near every magazine involved had finished. There's nothing quite as petty and as amusing as old Amiga wars, is there? Whew. With that, we have managed to sum up the whole Team 17 vs Amiga Power feud, or the Amiga Format vs Amiga Power feud, the Marcus Dyson vs Stuart Campbell vs Amiga Concept vs CU Amiga feud? Who knows at this point. The point is, of course, that all of these things were very intimately connected, which isn't something that gets highlighted a lot when we talk about this big clash. It is an interesting thing, really, as again, it's not like this is a case of good versus bad or anything like that. I wouldn't describe any of the participants in this feud as hacks by any measure. You've got what would be, for me, by some distance, the Amiga's two greatest magazines. Amiga Power will always be my number one, of course, but Format was also essential in its own way. It didn't have the humour as such, but it had the information, and obviously it had the software side that wasn't part of Power's remit. And then on the games company side, well, you've got Team 17, a company that did indeed produce a lot of cracking and successful games for the computer, and continued to make quality titles for it right up to the end, which ultimately came with the 1997 release of Worms the Director's Cut. It's a big old battle between some prominent, strong figures, and obviously they've all got frickin' strong opinions, and while some of the folks involved in the feud have expressed the odd bit of regret at how it all went down, I don't think they'd have actually changed anything. It's certainly important to keep the details of this big old battle alive, as much as it all happened nearly 30 years ago now. A lot of the sources for the skirmish are slowly starting to flitter away, and some of the people are too. Martin Brown, the founder and former boss of Team 17, is gone now, as is Amiga Power's Jonathan Nash, both legends who passed within weeks of each other as 2024 ended and 2025 began. Inevitably things get lost with each passing year, and a whole part of what goes on here is just, well, grabbing what you can. And if that means trawling through old, badly written Usenet posts filled with typos and invective, then so be it. And hey, the mud does have a nice vintage smell about it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.